Grow, Sell, and Retire is the podcast for the lazy overachiever. B.D. Dalton, author of The Assisted Purchase, True Gravity, and Grow, Sell, and Retire, is here to give his 25 years of secrets, tips, and assistance to take your business to the next level. This podcast is for anyone who wants to sell more, work less, and make better business. Now, here's your host, BD, with today's GSR podcast.
Hey everybody, very excited today. BD Dalton here for the Grow, Sell, and Retire podcast, doing one of our firsts, and this is our first kind of mini-series we're going to have. And we're lucky enough to have Dave Dodson on the podcast a couple months back, and thought that it'd be great to start off this year talking about crushing your competition. Dave Dodson, welcome to the show.
No, BD, I'm grateful to be able to come back here. I appreciate it.
We're going to have some fun with this. So we're going to do this in three parts. So you've got the manager's handbook, which last time I offensively called boring, which I was totally taking the mick out of that. But in general, I thought it was an amazing thing because it sounds like manager's handbook. Okay, we've been there before, but I think the key thing here that you put in the subheading, which is build a team, stay focused, make better decisions, and crush your competition, which is kind of the thing we're going to talk about today is crushing your competition. Today, we're going to talk about management superpowers. Next episode, we're going to talk about creating employee heroes, because it's not just about you, it's about, and the managers, it's about the team. And then the last one is leveraging strategy, because I know you're hot on strategy. But we're going to dive straight into management superpowers. But first of all, you've talked to quite a few people. So when you gather this up, could you walk us through just a little potted history of where you gathered your management information from and why we should listen to you today?
Sure. And actually, I don't know whether to take it as a compliment or an insult that you said that the book was boring. But I got to tell you, when I was writing the book, I really had this tension between, do I want to write something that's kind of like entertaining for the weekend and then people put it down and don't change behavior? Or do I want to set it up like a handbook where someone will read it and they'll say, okay, look, it wasn't necessarily the most entertaining story I ever read, but there's useful things in here that I'm going to implement starting tomorrow morning. And that was what I sort of aired towards. So that was definitely the intent of writing the manager's handbook. I wanted it to be a book that is not just read, but a book that was used. And how I got there, BD, was, and you and I have talked about this before on earlier podcasts, is that I was just noticing that some people were just much better at getting stuff done than others. And I wanted to move away from this kind of notion that great leaders were charismatic or born a certain way or looked a certain way. And what were really the true underlying characteristics of people who were great leaders, put another way, able to get things done. And I got absolutely infatuated with the story of Sam Walton, because I think back in 1961, he is surrounded by Target, Kmart, JCPenney, Sears. These are iconic brands. And he had nothing on them. And yet he absolutely annihilated all four of them. I mean, a couple of them are still in survival, but he annihilated them. And he didn't invent the department store. What he did is he consistently out-implemented them. And of course, if Sam Walton were alive today, he'd be the richest person on the planet. And then I started looking at other leaders like Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg from Facebook. And I realized that consistently these people that we put up on a pedestal as being able to see around corners and having X-ray vision really were just extraordinarily good at implementing things and getting things done across an organization. So then I had to kind of harness this and say, okay, well, that's fine, but that's not very useful. What specifically do they do? And how do they do it? And can mere mortals like you and me get our arms around this and actually do it? And sure enough, absolutely were achievable.
And so when we come to it, and I love your book, and we use it all the time. I've got it bookmarked to the 80 additional minutes a day, each day on page 119. So yeah, you actually, all the tactical stuff is amazing. So you ran through a bunch of names. I know you've interviewed a bunch of people that you actually, some of them you mentioned, some of them you didn't. But could you share a story where you witnessed actually superpowers in action? Because I know you just referred to the story of Sam Walton, but you've actually interviewed different managers and you've actually run businesses yourself. So what are some superpowers in action that you've seen that we might not even recognize as superpowers in ourselves as managers?
Interesting question. It brings me back, frankly, to very early on in my business career when I had a chance to have a one-on-one cocktail, frankly, with Herb Kelleher, the guy who started Southwest Airlines. And we were sitting at this bar in Palo Alto, and he tells me this story about the 10-minute turn. And the 10-minute turn was what saved Southwest Airlines. And Herb Kelleher is the CEO, was the CEO and founder of Southwest Airlines. And again, a little bit like Sam Walton, BD, he was surrounded by American Airlines, United Airlines, Delta. He had no business winning. And for many, many years, the end of the story is that Southwest Airlines became the most profitable airline in the world. But he was he was telling me this story. So he said, we were almost at the edge of bankruptcy. I think he said they had $180 in the checking account and had to sell a plane to make payroll. And he realized planes only make money when they're in the air. And so he developed the 10-minute turn, which was when a plane lands, I want it back up in the air in 10 minutes. Now, what was fascinating about that and why it's a perfect laboratory to your question, BD, is that in order to do that, he had to say, these are all the things we're not going to be focused on. We're going to be focused on one thing. And so, first of all, there's a whole chapter in the book about the ability to set and adhere to priorities. He set one priority. We have got to get the planes back up in the air. And the second thing he did as a leader is he harnessed the whole strength of the organization, because you don't get a plane back up in the air by just having an edict. You have to get the flight attendants, you have to get the baggage handlers, you have to get the gate agents. Everybody committed to that. So then he harnessed the whole organization around it. He came up with a very simple slogan, 10-minute turn. Maybe an analyst would have said, oh, actually the right amount is 12 minutes and 37 seconds, but that wouldn't work. He had to pick a number that everybody could just say 10-minute turn, 10-minute turn, 10-minute turn. And he completely saved the airline around it. That was tactical. He didn't see around corners. He wasn't a magician. He wasn't what he did as a manager is he got everybody focused on one thing to get things done. That's my favorite story about using a superpower. And by the way, BD, what he did could be done by every one of your listeners tomorrow.
So when you're looking at that and he was able to do that, how do you discover what you think you need to know? How does a manager sit back and look at their whole business? What's the number or what's the thing that they need to focus on? Because he said a plane doesn't make money unless it's in the sky. Right. How does a manufacturing or a software or somebody else in another company look at how they should find their 10-minute turn?
Exactly. So I simplified it to answer the essence of your story, but he didn't just come up with a 10-minute turn while he was walking to the office that day. It was actually a result of some serious analysis between he and his chief operating officer and right-hand person when he built Southwest Airlines. So let me move to a different story to better explain that. Steve Jobs and Apple Computer. You can't possibly imagine an organization that had more pulls, let's do this, let's do that, let's focus on this, than a company like Apple Computer, especially during the Steve Jobs era. Steve Jobs recognized that in order to set and adhere to priorities, his equivalent of a 10-minute turn, he needed to put in place a process. So it's all described in the book, in the manager's handbook. He made a process about how he would bring his key managers together, how they would go through this set of exercises to identify what are the possible priorities that need to be done, how you eliminate it down to just a few, and then focus the organization around that. And the magic of Steve Jobs is not that he was, a visionary in the sense that he knew where Apple should go. He was actually a process person. He surrounded himself with great people, which, by the way, is the first part of the book, the ability to build a team. He would surround himself with great people, and then collectively, they would establish what those priorities were. And then he was a ruthless enforcer of those priorities. And so when I wrote the part of the book about setting and adhering to priorities, instead of just saying, well, look what Herb Kelleher did, or look what Steve Jobs did, in the end, I said, here's the process that I've synthesized looking at all these different leaders. Run this process in your own organization. Whether you are a high school principal or you are running General Motors, it's actually the same process.
And when people apply those processes, they're looking for something that's either going to add to the bottom. Everything has to add to bottom line, doesn't it? Everything has to create something at the bottom line, because then you could hire more people or create more stuff or spend more on R&D. But it's not what sometimes we go with, managers go with their heart versus numbers in smaller organizations. So,
well, for sure, as you say, BD, and in most organizations that we think about, they're for-profit organizations, and if you don't bring in more money than you send out, eventually you're going to go out of business. But one of the keys to that is, as we've talked about, is focus. And by the way, just as a quick aside, I now run a workshop with much smaller companies than Apple Computer, where we go through a 2-day process of setting and adhering to priorities. And it's amazing the difference between what the CEOs will come in with as what they think is important, which is usually a very, very long list and not very specific. And they walk out with their equivalent of a 10-minute turn. And then I hear back from them 6 months later and they go, it was like turbocharging my organization.
That's what we all need. So as we're moving to crushing the competition, if you have your own specific 10-minute turn, then that's what everybody's adhering to. So you've got that, and you just talked about how you saw this in Sam Walton, you saw this with Herb Kelleher, you saw her with those. How do we identify our own superpowers? How do we look at what we're actually good at as a manager, and how do we start to uncover that without boasting or bragging that we're good at this?
My research in working with the Manager's Handbook, and as you said, BD, I also ran 5 companies prior to joining the faculty at Stanford Business School. So I was able to bridge my own personal experiences of what worked and what didn't work. The academic environment at Stanford at the business school, teaching students and listening to case subjects and so forth. And then my research that related to the Manager's Handbook. And what I found is that I do love the term superpower, but there's one part of it I don't like, which is there's an implication that we all have our kind of own special, unique superpowers that we should employ. Honestly, that's kind of a excuse to get away from the basics of how you run an organization. And that's why, by the way, you can crush your competition, because most people say, well, I'm going to do it on instinct, or I'm going to hire on gut feel, instead of I have a process that will lead to the best hiring of people. When I give feedback, I do it in a certain way. No, there's a specific way that you give feedback if you want to get the excellence out of your team, et cetera, et cetera. So the superpower is this, BD. The superpower is saying, wait a minute, okay? Some of this is tedious, some of this is hard work, but if I apply myself with these 5 critical skills, my superpower is the fact that I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to do the hard work. I'm willing to do even the stuff that is yucky, that is less interesting, that Jeff Bezos did at Amazon, for example. That became his superpower, to harness those 5 critical skills. If I sat down with any of your listeners today and I said, give me 90 minutes of your time, and I will radically change your ability to hire and retain great people, I would be 100 for 100, because I'm just walking people through the steps of good hiring that most people want to bypass. That's the superpower, being willing to do that.
And I've used your, we just hired 2 new people, and we used your questions, and we let go of somebody, and we used your easy way to let go of somebody in the tactics that are in the book. So it's applicable every day of the week. It's amazing. So superpowers. Some of these funny things that we have in Marvel and some of these other movies, where you think that you know who the superhero is, but they're actually the supervillain, or they're the supervillain, but by the end they're the superhero. What are some superpowers that actually masquerade or cover up other things, or we think that they're a superpower, but they're actually causing problems for us?
Well, if I could return to something that I was just referencing a minute ago, I think a great example to start with would be hiring. I cannot begin to count the number of people who say, I hire on gut feel, I hire on instinct. That they think is their superpower, that they can look at somebody and just get a sense of who they are and how they're going to perform. So let's spend a minute on that. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book, Talking with Strangers. Fascinating book. And he tells a story about the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and how he sized up Adolf Hitler, who was the Chancellor of Germany at the time. This is way before World War II. This is when it could have prevented World War II. And he went back to Britain, and he said he had this great feeling about Adolf Hitler, and he based it on, among other things, the way Hitler shook his hand, that he did it. He gave him his two-handed handshake that he saves only for special friends. And Neville Chamberlain used his gut feel and instinct to say, this is a man I can trust. By the way, Hitler fooled a lot of people.
Yes.
Okay. He didn't become a monster on the outside until after he had fooled so many people. The person that he did not fool was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill never met Hitler. And the fascinating part of that is, and the insightful part of it is Winston Churchill based his opinion on Hitler on data. He looked at how Hitler behaved, what decisions he made, what he did and what he didn't do, and he drew a conclusion from that. Neville Chamberlain sized up Hitler based on gut feel. Okay, now let's bring it back to earth here, okay? Talk about, hiring. We do exactly the same thing. We look for if we're not hiring well, we look at likability. Are they sort of similar to us? Did they have good, snappy answers to our question? As opposed to, what is actually the data? What are the outcomes I'm looking for when I hire this person? And how am I going to figure out whether those outcomes will happen under this person? And I lay out that step by step in the manager's handbook. So to sort of come full circle with your question, BD, a false superpower is this kind of gut feel instinct. The real superpower is I run a hiring process that is excellent. And as a result of running an excellent hiring process, I hire above my competition. I get people from my competition. My people are better. And then you get to crush your competition.
So who's doing this really well right now? So if you're looking at managers, if we go notable brand names, who's out hiring people right now? It used to be Facebook because they are Meta or whatever they're called at this point in time, because they just paid more and they were buying everybody and acquiring. But now I think there's a leveling up happening in tech. But who's out there right now hiring the best of the best that you're seeing in commercial world versus academic world?
I think Amazon runs a fantastic process when they hire. McKinsey and Company, and I know McKinsey and Company comes under fire at sometimes because they're so big and they have their hands in so many different businesses, but they run a very methodical process to hire people. The common denominator of Amazon and McKinsey and many others is that it's process driven. By the way, we may have talked about this before, BD. I'm not sure about this, but when I got really deep into the hiring piece of the manager's handbook, I went and I got, I don't know, it was probably like a dozen hiring books. I mean, there's a lot. And I stacked them up and I shut the door and I said, nobody talked to me for a week. And I read all of these books. Well, first of all, what was common is they all said, you got to run a process. Every process was a little bit different. But I harmonized this process into, I took what was arguably, 1,000 pages, and I put it into 25 pages. And I put it into 25 pages because, my readers don't have time to do what I did, which is read 25 books or a dozen books.
That's the best part about books. That's the best part about coaches dealing with that type of stuff, is that you're getting somebody's knowledge, wisdom, and their reading and learning to be delivered here. And I think your book in the Manager Handbook is actually one of the most tactical, hands-on managers documents that I've read. So
yeah, I tried to take each piece of it, BD, and I said, how can I describe this in as few words as possible, as opposed to how can I fill a book? And some chapters are 8 pages, some chapters are 20 pages, but the goal was get your point as quickly as possible so that my busy reader can get back to running their organization.
So what's a management power? So we've gone through the hiring, which is that, but which other one do you think is most underrated when it comes to looking at the business and sitting back as a manager? Is we've gotten gut instinct in there, and we've got the hiring. What's an underrated one that people should be looking at this year if they're doing after they've got the hiring done and they've got the helicopter look?
Yeah.
What's something else that they should really be sitting back and going, hey, I need to really work on that?
Oh, this one is screaming in my ear. I can't wait to answer your question. So it started with, I was having a cup of coffee with a good friend of mine who at the time was COO of Disney. And we had a coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was outside at the Stanford campus. And I got there at 10:03 or 10:04. I was late. He was sitting there calm as a cucumber. His name is Tom Staggs. Tom, at the time, had 250,000 people in his part of the organization in 6 continents, okay? He's on time. I'm the one who's late, okay? And he's looking at his phone, probably responding to a text message from his son. And I'm like the proverbial chicken with his head cut off. So I just said, Tom, like, how do you do it? I mean, you have 250,000 people that are depending upon you, and you're sitting here reading a text message from your son, and I'm the one who's late. And that's when we got pulled into this conversation about how the best leaders are extraordinarily good at managing their day. And most people wake up and they open up their email and they chase the shiny objects and go doing the things that they enjoy and that they're good at instead of the things that are going to really drive the organization forward. And subsequent to my, so I had to take, Tom, I had this big aha when I was with Tom, but then I had to convert it into, first of all, taking care of my own day. So there, Professor Michael Porter, who is the most prolific business professor in terms of writing ever, professor at Harvard Business School. And he was visiting me in Jackson Hole, and kind of the same thing. He was sort of watching me run around, and he said, I'm going to do an intervention. So he did an intervention, and he actually looked at how I managed my day. And he said, I want you to apply these things that we learned when we did a study at Harvard on about 100 CEOs. And they followed these CEOs in 15-minute increments, collecting 60,000 pieces of data on how these CEOs managed their day. And they all had a very specific way that they could quiet the noise and focus on the things that was most important. So BD, the other superpower is planning out your day in the morning or the night before. Most people need to do it in the morning in a way that you stay focused on the 3 or 4 things that are really going to drive your organization forward and saying no to everything else. And I've got a routine that I do every morning. I describe it in the book. It takes about a whopping 4 or 5 minutes, maybe not even that, to plan out my day. And once I built that routine in place and I do it religiously, I went from 40 miles an hour to 140 miles an hour. And I've had people say, God, like, I cannot believe you do all these different things and you get all this stuff done. And how do you do it? I go, well, because I take about 4 minutes in the morning and plan out my day. It's actually not that complicated. I also do, which I describe in the book, how to avoid the incoming traffic of text messages and emails and so forth, and that dopamine hit that you get when you get to clear off your email, but it's not actually moving the organization forward. Well, I could say to your listeners, hey, be better about the digital distractions, and everyone would nod till their head would come off, but then they go back and do the same thing. So in the book, I say, okay, here's 7 steps, 7 things. You do these 7 things and you will knock out about 80% of the digital noise so that you can focus on the things that really will move your organization forward.
How about if you give us 2 of those? Don't give them all. Well, everybody's got to go buy the book, obviously, but give us 1 or 2 of those so that we can actually turn around today and say, here's one thing that I'm doing that Dave told me to do.
All right, I'll give you a couple of really simple ones. One is take all your 30-minute meetings and change them to 20-minute meetings. Take all your 60-minute meetings and change them to 40-minute meetings. That's going to save you, if you have a typical calendar like mine, about an hour and a half a day, literally, and you'll get the same amount of work done. That's one. Second thing, ruthlessly unsubscribe. When you get something that comes in your inbox, what they're basically saying is, hey, stop doing what you're doing and pay attention to me. Read my article, look at my ads. You got to ruthlessly unsubscribe because they're extraordinarily good at grabbing your attention. The next thing is to set certain limits on when you read email. Now, most people find that really hard because it's so fun to get off of the deep work, the stuff that's hard, and go answer some mindless emails. So what I say to people is I say, okay, look, start easy. Say, I'm going to look at my email 6 times a day, okay? And when I look at it, ask yourself this simple question. If I had looked at it earlier, would it have changed the outcome? The answer is almost always going to be no. So you go from 6 and you go, wow, that was really much better. And then you go to 4 and you go, that was fantastic. And you go to 3 and now you're really starting to get things done. But you can't just sort of say, read your email less often. You have to set limits. And it doesn't matter whether you start at 6 or 16, okay? And then scale back. So those are 3 quick ones.
Those are awesome. And I mean, if you do all those things and you're only checking your emails, that you've just bought everybody 2 hours of their day. So,
well, BD, we've all been on planes or in some situation where the internet didn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you get off the plane and you're like, geez, I cannot believe how much work I got done. Right?
Yeah. Or how much more relaxed I am, or how the world didn't end.
Yesterday I had a flight from Denver to Boston, and I said, I'm not going to connect to the internet until 30 minutes before landing. I got so much important stuff done yesterday on the plane.
That is awesome. So if you're looking at this, and you're kind of looking at a manager, and you're stepping back, what's the best question that you can, as a manager, ask your team or your business?
The best question about
anything. The best question that you can ask, because if we got Herb Kelleher looked at it and said the 10-minute turnaround, and so what's the if you were just that killer question that might be sitting there in the background, that
I'm going to completely plagiarize Steve Jobs.
Perfect, go for it.
He would go around, and this is a story I learned from Johnny Ive, who was his chief designer. He was the guy. If you have an apple and you like how it looks and how it works, that's the person you have to thank for it. And what he said was that Steve Jobs would walk around and he would ask this one question: what have you said no to today? The point is that focus and priority is not about not doing the things that you shouldn't do. It's about doing the things that you know, as Johnny Ive said, as you know in your heart are great ideas, but you can't do it because you're working on something else. And so if I could go around and ask anybody that question, I would say, what did you say no to today? What did you say no to today? And all I'm doing is I'm quoting Steve Jobs.
That's awesome. There's plagiarism and piracy rules the world, especially when it comes to good ideas.
There are not that many there are not many things that need to be invented. I mean, that was one of the pleasures of writing the manager's handbook, is I really just curated the best practices of fantastic leaders and got it down into a few pages. I was a curator. I didn't invent anything in that book.
But everything you've done is you've dispelled and put it into simple, tactical things that we can do today. So this is coming kind of to the end of our management superpowers. And next time we're going to come back and we're going to talk about creating employee heroes. So to kind of lead us into that, thinking about creating employee heroes, what do you want us to think about or bring back to the table for session 2 when we're thinking about, as a manager, looking at our team? We've just asked them a question of what have you said no to today? How are we going to start to rev them up so that somebody can come back and listen to episode 2?
It wasn't until I was deep into finishing the book that something dawned on me, which was that the leaders that I had studied were really teachers. And it was actually when I was stumbling upon or thinking about Jeff Bezos and how he ran Amazon. And I want people to think about it this way. First of all, by the way, like the other leaders I mentioned, Jeff Bezos did not invent book sales. He did not invent buying things online. He should have been crushed by Barnes & Noble and Walden Books and everything who had cheaper cost of goods sold and better brand names. He out-implemented them. And he out-implemented them because he realized this. And I'll just use an example of meetings. What difference does it make if Jeff Bezos is great at running meetings and everybody else in his organization is poor at running meetings? And then flip it around and say, what if everybody at Amazon was great at running meetings and Jeff Bezos ran lousy meetings? Of course you would take the latter. And so the point is that these great leaders, first of all, they need to embrace these skills themselves. But then quickly, the whole point of it is to teach those skills to your team. And that's when all of a sudden an organization takes off. There are no one-person organizations out there that are successful. The best organizations are the ones that have learned and embraced the importance of teaching everybody else how to manage their email, everybody else how to hire well, everybody else how to run good meetings.
Dave, it's been amazing having you on, talking about the Manager's Handbook, talking about crushing your competition, and about management superpowers. Can't wait to have episode 2 coming up soon. Thanks so much for being on Grow, Sell, and Retire.
Okay, BD.
Thanks for joining us on Grow, Sell, and Retire. For more information, tools, or to book one of our team members to work with your team, business, or to speak at your event or conference, visit rockfind.co.uk. If you like the podcast, you'll love one of BD's 3 books: The Assisted Purchase, True Gravity, and the book the podcast is based on, Grow, Sell, and Retire. If you want to work for the rest of your life, that is your business. If you don't, that is ours.